Welcome. I'm Jimmy. This is a philosophy hour live stream, and the premise of these live streams is actually just that I will read a text out loud and give anyone who is here a chance to comment or raise any questions that might occur to them. And I will also stop along the way to comment and explain. I think this, in my experience, this is a little unusual. Maybe sometimes there's a perception that reading a text out loud in a group is kind of a waste of time. Everyone should sort of read ahead of time and come prepared with something. But I actually really like reading a text with a group out loud and stopping along the way at points where the group feels it's appropriate to stop. It allows a level of detail that I don't think is possible any other way. And it's especially helpful with a text like this one, The Practice of Everyday Life by Michel de Certeau, because it's a somewhat difficult text, especially the first time through, especially if you haven't read French philosophy or social theory before. It's a little hard to get into. So reading it out loud, it slows things down. It forces me and anyone else to sort of go just a little more slowly and gives an opportunity for more reflection and conversation along the way. So I really enjoy this as a way of getting into a text, especially one that's a little more challenging. So you can view this as sort of halfway between an audiobook and a lecture. I also think historically, a lecture actually was just a reading. Before texts were widely available, you would go listen to a reading of a text, and you would listen to someone explain it along the way. So this is a lecture in that very sort of classic, old-fashioned sense. So why Michel de Certeau? De Certeau was a French social theorist. He was also a Jesuit priest. He was engaged with people like Foucault and Bourdieu, and I think sort of viewed his work as sort of a counterpoint to their work. But the reason I'm interested in speaking to him on this channel, or speaking about him, of him, is that the channel was really inspired by some ideas from de Certeau, specifically this idea of small everyday practices as forms of resistance to power, and the idea that philosophy itself can be a tactic, which is a form of resistance in Certeau's vocabulary. Philosophy can be one of these forms of everyday resistance. So that's why de Certeau. I have one video on him which hits a couple of highlights, but doesn't go into a lot of detail. So I thought it might be interesting to spend a little more time on his book, maybe a few weeks, maybe longer, depending on how it goes. So that's why de Certeau. So today I'm just going to look at the introduction and see how far we get. If you happen to be here, we have back to 0 concurrent viewers. I won't invite you to introduce yourself since you're not here. So let's go ahead. I'm just going to get into the text, and this will be available for whoever wants to view it down the road. So this is the general introduction to the Practice of Everyday Life by Michel de Certeau. And if you're just joining, I'd love for you to introduce yourself, or to, along the way, drop any questions or comments you might have in the chat. So de Certeau writes, and I'm viewing here on my screen where I have the text, "This essay is part of a continuing investigation of the ways in which users, commonly assumed to be passive and guided by established rules, operate. The point is not so much to discuss this elusive yet fundamental subject as to make such a discussion possible, that is, by means of inquiries and hypotheses to indicate pathways for further research. This goal will be achieved if everyday practices," I think it's helpful just to note that in French we have this word quotidien, or in English we do, and this is the French word that's translated here by everyday, which has a slightly different valence than the English word everyday, which suggests on every single day. Every day means quotidian, which means like in the day-to-day. Everyday practices, ways of operating, or doing things no longer appear as merely the obscure background of social activity. And if a body of theoretical questions, methods, categories, and perspectives, by penetrating this obscurity, make it possible to articulate them. So the language is a little convoluted. That's going to be true all throughout. But what he introduces here is this idea of users, or maybe actors is a better word, agents, people who are doing something, are commonly, he says, they're commonly assumed to be passive and guided by established rules. But he wants to find out, how do they actually operate? How do agents operate in the world? And he wants to open up a whole realm of research to explore this. And why that's significant will become clear over the subsequent pages and paragraphs. The examination of such practices does not imply a return to individuality. So he's not interested in the individual subject or the social individual. The social atomism, which over the past 3 centuries has served as the historical axiom of social analysis, posits an elementary unit, the individual, on the basis of which groups are supposed to be formed and to which they are supposed to be always reducible. This axiom, which has been challenged by more than a century of sociological, economic, anthropological, and psychoanalytic research, although in history that is perhaps no argument, plays no part in this study. So it's not about the individual. And in a way, I think he's saying the idea of the individual is misguided, as this next sentence will show. Analysis shows that a relation, always social, determines its terms. So the individual is always related, and not the reverse. In other words, the relation is fundamental. The individual is not sort of existing on its own terms, and then subsequently entering into relationships. The relationship is the fundamental thing that the individual emerges out of. And that each individual is a locus in which an incoherent and often contradictory plurality of such relational determinations interact. Moreover, the question at hand concerns modes of operation or schemata of action, and not directly the subjects or persons who are their authors or vehicles. So not only is the individual kind of a misconception, because relationality is more fundamental, but he's interested in modes of acting, possibilities of action, not in the individuals who take those modes. It concerns an operational logic whose models may go as far back as the age-old ruses of fishes and insects that disguise or transform themselves in order to survive, and which has in any case been concealed by the form of rationality currently dominant in Western culture. So he thinks there's even an evolutionary prehistory to this idea, what he's going to call tactics, the way that fish or insects conceal themselves through disguises or ruses. The purpose of this work is to make explicit the systems of operational combination, I'm not going to try to read the French, which also compose a culture, and to bring to light the models of action characteristic of users whose status as the dominated element in society, a status that does not mean that they are either passive or docile, is concealed by the euphemistic term consumers. Everyday life invents itself by poaching in countless ways on the property of others. So he tells us a little bit more about the users or actors that he has in mind. He says they are the dominated element in society. But he says that doesn't mean passivity or docility. So he wants to explore what is the sort of agency or activity that is possible for this dominated element in society, and what is this element. So subsection 1 of this introduction, consumer production. Since this work grew out of studies of popular culture or marginal groups. The investigation of everyday practices was first delimited negatively by the necessity of not locating cultural difference in groups associated with the counterculture, groups that were already singled out, often privileged, and already partly absorbed into folklore, and that were no more than symptoms or indexes. So he's saying the dominated element, the users whose level of agency he wants to explore, whose mode of agency, it's not counterculture. Okay. He says counterculture is a symptom or an index. An index is something that uh, tells you of the presence of something else. So like smoke is an index of fire. 3 further positive determinations were particularly important in articulating our research. So what is the subject? It's not the counterculture, but it is these users, this dominated element in society. Usage or consumption. Many often remarkable works have sought to study the representations of a society on the one hand and its modes of behavior on the other. Building on our knowledge of these social phenomena, it seems both possible and necessary to determine the use to which they are put by groups or individuals. For example, the analysis of the images broadcast by television representation and of the time spent watching television behavior should be complemented by a study of what the cultural consumer makes or does during this time and with these images. The same goes for the use of urban space, the products purchased in the supermarket, the stories and legends distributed by the newspapers, and so on. If you're just tuning in, you're welcome to introduce yourself in the chat, and also feel free to drop any comments or questions you may have. This is a reading of Michel de Certeau, The Practice of Everyday Life, and the introduction. So just to comment on this paragraph I just read, de Certeau is asking, we have this passive consumption that takes place where people, for example, watch television. And of course, this was written before the internet and social media. And he says, yes, it's interesting to analyze the things that are consumed and the way in which those products of consumption are made or produced. But he also says, what about the way that the consumers make use of those things that they're consuming? And that's the question that he's interested in. The making in question is a production, a poiesis, but a hidden one because it is scattered over areas defined and occupied by systems of production, television, urban development, commerce, etc., and because the steadily increasing expansion of these systems no longer leaves consumers any place in which they can indicate what they make or do with the products of these systems. So these systems of production that consumers consume are expanding, increasing, and they occupy this place, which is a key term for de Certeau. And we don't know what the people on the other end do with them. To a rationalized, expansionist, and at the same time centralized, clamorous, and spectacular production corresponds another production called consumption. The latter is devious, it is dispersed, but it insinuates itself everywhere, silently and almost invisibly, because it does not manifest itself through its own products, but rather through its ways of using the products imposed by a dominant economic order. So we don't know what people do with the things that they consume. This was especially true 30, 40, 50 years ago when, you had broadcast television or even radio going further back, and you had what seemed to be passive consumers on the other end. It would be interesting to ask whether de Certeau's premise still holds in the same way now that anyone can take some product and turn it into something else and send it back out into the world in a way like what I'm doing right now with YouTube. And I could imagine, this is worth, I'll sort of touch on this as I go, but I could imagine on the one hand saying that things have changed dramatically. Now everyone is a producer as well as a consumer. On the other hand, we might ask whether this new circumstance has it limited the possibilities of agency or expanded them? Because our agency is funneled through certain devices, certain platforms, is that a restriction in the end? I'm not sure actually, but it's a question that I would want to think about. For instance, to continue the reading, the ambiguity that subverted from within the Spanish colonizers' success in imposing their own culture on the indigenous Indians is well known. Submissive and even consenting to their subjection, the Indians nevertheless often made of the rituals, representations, and laws imposed on them something quite different from what their conquerors had in mind. They subverted them, not by rejecting or altering them, but using them with respect to ends and references foreign to the system they had no choice but to accept. They were other within the very colonization that outwardly assimilated them. Their use of the dominant social order deflected its power, which they lacked the means to challenge. They escaped it without leaving it. The strength of their difference lay in procedures of consumption. To a lesser degree, a similar ambiguity creeps into our societies through the use made by the, quote, common people of the culture disseminated and imposed by the, quote, elites producing the language. So here's our first really concrete example. The Spanish colonizers imposed their culture on indigenous populations who they conquered. But those populations took what they were given, what was imposed on them, and made it into something that went against the intention of that thing. So he says their use of the dominant social order deflected its power. They escaped it without leaving it. This is Certeau's idea of a tactic in a nutshell. It's this deflection from within, or this subversion from within. The presence and circulation of a representation taught by preachers, educators, and popularizers as the key to socioeconomic advancement tells us nothing about what it is for its users. We must first analyze its manipulation by users who are not its makers. So this is what he wants to, this is what de Certeau views as his research field, is what do users or consumers do with the things that are given to them to consume or imposed on them. Only then can we gauge the difference or similarity between the production of the image and the secondary production hidden in the process of its utilization. So there's a sublayer of reproduction or use that is hidden in this sort of official line about what is the case. And you can see here how de Certeau is influenced to a degree by the thought of someone like Freud, who was interested in the unconscious or the subconscious meanings of things. And de Certeau is asking something like this about dominant modes of cultural production and saying there's a hidden layer behind the official layer that you can detect if you know how to find it. Our investigation is concerned with this difference. It can use as its theoretical model the construction of individual sentences with an established vocabulary and syntax. So this is an important theoretical framework that de Certeau uses to structure his entire book. So it's worth just tracking with this. In linguistics, performance and competence are different. The act of speaking, with all the enunciative strategies that implies, is not reducible to a knowledge of the language. By adopting the point of view of enunciation, which is the subject of our study, we privilege the act of speaking. According to that point of view, speaking operates within the field of a linguistic system. It effects an appropriation or reappropriation of language by its speakers. It establishes a present relative to a time and place, and it posits a contract with the other, the interlocutor, in a network of places and relations. These four characteristics of the Speech Act can be found in many other practices, walking, cooking, etc. An objective is at least adumbrated by this parallel, which is, as we shall see, only partly valid. Such an objective assumes that, like the Indians mentioned above, users make, bricolant, innumerable and infinitesimal transformations of and within the dominant cultural economy in order to adapt it to their own interests and their own rules. We must determine the procedures, bases, effects, and possibilities of this collective activity. So this theoretical framework, I believe he's taking from Ferdinand de Saussure, who is the founder of modern linguistics, and has this distinction between langue, or language, and parole, or speech. And Saussure thinks of language as kind of an abstraction, a sort of a fixed entity, something that you could write up in a grammar or a study of a language. And it's a set of fixed possibilities. Speech is how users, to go back to that term, make use of language. And it's what they do on the ground with it. It's how they redo it, subvert it, use it for their own purposes. And this model from linguistics is probably the basic the most basic theoretical framework that de Certeau is using in this book. But I think it's helpful to think of what he's doing here as actually constructing a series of analogies. So we've already talked about users and how they sort of subvert from within. That's the field, the field of research that de Certeau wants to explore. But he's going to give us a series of analogies to conceptualize what's going on there. And the first analogy is this distinction between language and speech, or language and the word he uses here, enunciation. And a key line here in the middle of this paragraph, enunciation, or speech, effects an appropriation or reappropriation of language by its speakers. So the speakers are doing things with language which may fit with this sort of, official, like, theoretical construct of the language, but may not. Okay, so let's go on to the next section. The procedures of everyday creativity. A second orientation of our investigation can be explained by reference to Michel Foucault's Discipline and Punish. And Foucault is one of two social theorists that I think are important interlocutors for de Certeau. The other one would be Pierre Bourdieu. In this work, instead of analyzing the apparatus exercising power, that is the localizable, expansionist, repressive, and legal institutions, Foucault analyzes the mechanisms, dispositifs, that have sapped the strength of these institutions and surreptitiously reorganized the functioning of power. Minuscule technical procedures acting on and with details, redistributing a discursive space in order to make it the means of a generalized discipline, surveillance. This approach raises a new and different set of problems to be investigated. Once again, however, this microphysics of power privileges the productive apparatus which produces the discipline, even though it discerns in, quote, education, a system of repression. It shows how, from the wings, as it were, silent technologies determine or short-circuit institutional stage directions. So Foucault tells us that power is exercised in these very subtle ways that may be different than what he calls here the stage directions, the official exercise of power, the official institutions. If it is true, as Foucault says, that the grid of discipline is everywhere becoming clearer and more extensive, it is all the more urgent to discover how an entire society resists being reduced to it. what popular procedures, also minuscule and quotidian, manipulate the mechanisms of discipline and conform to them, only in order to evade them. And finally, what ways of operating form the counterpart on the consumer's or dominee's side of the mute processes that organize the establishment of socio-economic order. So if this grid of discipline, of surveillance that Foucault identifies, discusses, observes, is becoming more extensive, more powerful, if the screws of that form of power and discipline are being tightened. Certeau says it's urgent to discover how do we resist in small ways the incursion of this power. These ways of operating constitute the innumerable practices by means of which users reappropriate the space organized by techniques of socio-cultural production. They pose questions at once analogous and contrary to those dealt with in Foucault's book. Analogous in that the goal is to perceive and analyze the microbe-like operations proliferating within technocratic structures and deflecting their functioning by means of a multitude of tactics articulated in the details of everyday life. Contrary, in that the goal is not to make clearer how the violence of order is transmuted into a disciplinary technology, but rather to bring to light the clandestine forms taken by the dispersed, tactical, and makeshift creativity of groups or individuals already caught in the nets of discipline. Pushed to their ideal limits, these procedures and ruses of consumers compose the network of an anti-discipline, which is the subject of this book. So Foucault's book is Discipline and Punish. We could have retitled de Certeau's book Anti-Discipline. Here I wonder, we have these microbe-like operations proliferating within technocratic structures. This is where I wonder to what degree something like YouTube is an anti-discipline, or is it an extension of the discipline? Because it is this microbe-like structure that proliferates throughout our lives. The devices, the digital devices, the use of social media, so that, yes, we may be producing and creating by means of these devices, but we're also living increasingly through those devices almost entirely. So is it a tightening of discipline that we live our lives through our iPhones or other devices more and more every day, every year? Or is this opening up new possibilities for anti-discipline and resistance? The example that comes to mind is from about a decade or so ago when social media was being viewed as a really new democratic opportunity and an opportunity to spread, to resist, say, authoritarianism around the world, and it seemed like it was going to accomplish that. Fast forward to 2025, and it can often seem like the opposite is the case. And the way that some of these social media companies are structured is authoritarian in its own way, and the results have been negative. And it may be a both and. It may be that the internet and social media, the platforms through which we use the internet, both have the potential to be a proliferation of technocratic structure and an opportunity to resist. But I think if we are going to use them as forms of resistance, we need to be very self-conscious about how we go about that, because it's very easy to get sucked into the technocratic structure rather than resisting it. So the formal structure of practice. And this seems like an allusion to Bourdieu's, what is his book called? The Logic of Practice. So it may be supposed that these operations, multiform and fragmentary relative to situations and details, insinuated into and concealed within devices whose mode of usage they constitute, and thus lacking their own ideologies or institutions, conform to certain rules. So, do tactics, do these ways that users subvert the dominant order, do they conform to rules? In other words, there must be a logic of these practices. So, yes, he's referring to Bourdieu. We are thus confronted once again by the ancient problem: what is an art or way of making? From the Greeks to Durkheim, a long tradition has sought to describe with precision the complex and not at all simple or impoverished rules that could account for these operations. From this point of view, popular culture, as well as a whole literature called popular, take on a different aspect. They present themselves essentially as arts of making this or that. That is, as combinatory or utilizing modes of consumption. These practices bring into play a popular ratio, a way of thinking invested in a way of acting, an art of combination which cannot be dissociated from art of using. So how do these popular practices work? That paragraph was basically a convoluted way of asking that question. In order to grasp the formal structures of these practices, I have carried out two sorts of investigations. The first, more descriptive in nature, has concerned certain ways of making that were selected according to their value for the strategy of the analysis, and with a view to obtaining fairly differentiated variants. Readers' practices, practices related to urban spaces, utilizations of everyday rituals, reuses and functions of the memory through the authorities that make possible or permit everyday practices, etc. In addition, two related investigations have tried to trace the intricate forms of the operations proper to the recomposition of a space, the Croix-Rousse quarter in Lyon, by familial practices on the one hand, and on the other, to the tactics of the art of cooking, which simultaneously organizes a network of relations, poetic ways of making do, bricolage, and a reuse of marketing structures. So those two examples, actually those last two about this quarter in Lyon and cooking, come in volume 2 of this book, which I have not read actually, but I plan to. But this first set is what he discusses in this first volume. So I'm going to skip this. He's mentioning a lot of names. These couple of paragraphs are important, though, because they give you a sense of the incredible breadth of sources that de Certeau knows and draws on in this book. I think this is another element of what can make it a sort of difficult book to read, because he presupposes a little bit of familiarity with these each of these authors and schools of thought, and he's going to range from linguistics to history to sociology and anthropology to analytic philosophy. It's quite remarkable. Maybe it was the case that there was an audience in France in the middle of the 20th century, presumably an academic audience, that was familiar with all of these disciplines. Paul Ricoeur is another person who sort of ranges this widely and acts as if it's no big deal. But for most of us, this is pretty difficult to access. So it's another reason why reading the text out loud and just slowly going through it can be helpful. So I'm going to skip to this next section, the marginality of a majority. These three determinations make possible an exploration of the cultural field, an exploration defined by an investigative problematics and punctuated by more detailed inquiries, located by reference to hypotheses that remain to be verified. Such an exploration will seek to situate the types of operations characterizing consumption in the framework of an economy, and to discern in these practices of appropriation indexes of the creativity that flourishes at the very point where practice ceases to have its own language. Hello, I don't know what I am here for. Welcome. I will reintroduce what we're up to. I'm reading the introduction to Michel de Certeau's book, The Practice of Everyday Life. Um, this book is a work of social theory from, I think it was written in the 80s. And the idea of the book is to analyze tactics or strategies of everyday resistance to the network of power that exists in society. And it's really one of the premises or inspirations for this channel, which is that philosophy itself can be an everyday tactic or practice that facilitates resistance and freedom. So I'm reading through the text out loud because it's a difficult text and because it also allows us to engage with it in a little more detail. So if you're viewing, I would welcome you to introduce yourself and to add any questions or comments you might have in the chat. So Certeau is trying to articulate for us these tactics of resistance that consumers exercise. And he's going to talk about marginality now, which in a way he's trying to say, well, where are these consumers or users? Where are they located? So he says marginality is today no longer limited to minority groups, but is rather massive and pervasive. This cultural activity of the non-producers of culture, an activity that is unsigned, unreadable, and unsymbolized, remains the only one possible for all those who nevertheless buy and pay for the showy products through which a productivist economy articulates itself. Marginality is becoming universal. A marginal group has now become a silent majority. So we speak today of marginalized groups, minorities, things like this. But Foucault is saying that in an economic and a social sense, marginality is widespread because there are a few centers of power and production, and everyone else basically has the option to, basically has no option but to accept the products that those centers of power offer. And so he's saying that marginality is becoming universal because most of us are in this condition, or perhaps all of us. That does not mean the group is homogeneous. The procedures allowing the reuse of products are linked together in a kind of obligatory language, and their functioning is related to social situations and power relationships. Confronted by images on television, the immigrant worker does not have the same critical or creative elbow room as the average citizen. On the same terrain, his inferior access to information, financial means, and compensations of all kinds elicits an increased deviousness, fantasy, or laughter. Similar strategic deployments, when acting on different relationships of force, do not produce identical effects. Hence the necessity of differentiating both the actions or engagements in the military sense that the system of products effects within the consumer grid, and the various kinds of room to maneuver left for consumers by the situations in which they exercise their art. Hi, Samina, welcome. Thank you for commenting. Yeah, it is hard to jump in at this point. The video will be available after the live stream. But just to reiterate, Michel de Certeau writes in this book, The Practice of Everyday Life, about small tactics of resistance that can be carried out in day-to-day life. And yeah, I'm really glad you're getting into this philosophy. It's kind of a high barrier to entry, especially with a text like this, but it's also it's very rich. There's a lot of cool stuff here. Again, that's why I think reading it out loud is nice, because it lets us access the text itself. We could say reading out loud is a tactic in its own way. So he said marginality is becoming universal. This is a key point. But those of us who are marginal are not homogeneous. We're not all the same. So he considers the immigrant worker who's going to have inferior access to information but is also going to exercise tactics in their own way. The relation of procedures to the fields of force in which they act must therefore lead to a polemological analysis of culture. And if you know the word polemics, sort of adversarial speech, he's saying culture has this polemical element, this conflictual element. And he's talking about there's a conflict between procedures and these fields of force, between the way that individual agents, actors, consumers sort of subvert the structures of power and those structures of power which they are subverting. Like law, one of its models, culture articulates conflicts and alternately legitimizes, displaces, or controls the superior force. It develops in an atmosphere of tensions and often of violence, for which it provides symbolic balances, contracts of compatibility, and compromises, all more or less temporary. The tactics of consumption, the ingenious ways in which the weak make use of the strong, thus lend a political dimension to everyday practices. This is a nice summary of the premise of the book. The way that the weak make use of the strong in these subtle, subversive, everyday ways lends a political dimension to everyday practices. And that's why later on he looks at the way that space is structured, or things like cooking or shopping or walking around in a city. He says there's actually potentially a political dimension to these things because they can function as modes of resistance. So that was all the first subsection of the introduction. I'll go for another 15 minutes or so. I'll take a stab at this second subsection of Michel de Certeau's The Practice of Everyday Life. If you're just jumping in, welcome. Feel free to introduce yourself or drop a comment or question in the chat. This is just a live reading / commentary and discussion of this text. In the course of our research, the scheme, rather too neatly dichotomized, of the relations between consumers and the mechanisms of production has been diversified in relation to three kinds of concerns: the search for a problematics that could articulate the material collected, the description of a limited number of practices, reading, talking, walking, dwelling, cooking, etc., considered to be particularly significant, and the extension of the analysis of these everyday operations to scientific fields apparently governed by another kind of logic. Through the presentation of our investigation along these three lines, the overly schematic character of the general statement can be somewhat nuanced. So his writing, I recognize, continues to be somewhat convoluted. But he's identifying three concerns, which I think are going to structure the rest of this subsection. How do we get this material? Number one. What are the practices we're going to look at? Number two. And can we extend this to fields of science, or really fields of knowledge, governed by apparently another kind of logic? So do the practices that will be analyzed in the book, do they extend to other areas? So trajectories, tactics, and rhetorics. As unrecognized producers, poets of their own acts, silent discoverers of their own paths in the jungle of functionalist rationality, consumers produce, through their signifying practices, something that might be considered similar to the wandering lines drawn by autistic children studied by F. Deligny, indirect or errant trajectories, obeying their own logic. In the technocratically constructed, written, and functionalized space in which the consumers move about, their trajectories form unforeseeable sentences, partly readable paths across a space. Although they are composed with the vocabularies of established languages, those of television, newspapers, supermarkets, or museum sequences, and although they remain subordinated to the prescribed syntactical forms, temporal modes of schedules, paradigmatic orders of spaces, etc. The trajectories trace out the ruses of other interests and desires that are neither determined nor captured by the systems in which they develop. I'm going to keep going because I think that was more or less a repetition of ideas we've already discussed. Even statistical investigation remains virtually ignorant of these trajectories, since it is satisfied with classifying, calculating, and putting into tables the, quote, lexical units which compose them, but to which they cannot be reduced, and with doing this in reference to its own categories and taxonomies. Now, this is interesting because today we have capacity for statistical analysis on a level that Certeau probably could not have imagined. But it's interesting that we're still classifying, calculating into lexical units, which is very much what artificial intelligence does. A comment, just a little quest. Yeah, I could do that. I could try to discuss some different approaches to philosophy for sure. Thanks for that comment. I will have that in mind. So when we think about Certeau saying, okay, we can't statistically analyze tactics, these on-the-ground forms of resistance, because they're singular. I think the aspiration of contemporary big data and of artificial intelligence, these large language models, is that we would be able to do that. But it's interesting. He said he identifies the very method that these models use, which is to break things down into lexical units and then predict the probability of the next unit. He says tactics, these strategies of everyday resistance, cannot be reduced to lexical units. It cannot be placed in the categories and taxonomies appropriate to statistics. I think if we want to resist this new grid of power that AI is making possible, we need to have a very clear sense of what it would mean to resist the way that this new type of power structures its power. He's saying, I think this is a very hopeful thing in this moment to say that putting these things into lexical units, using big data and statistical analysis, it can't capture the full possibilities for human resistance. Statistical investigation grasps the material of these practices, but not their form, not the structure or the shape of it. It determines the elements used, but not the phrasing produced by the bricolage. Bricolage is kind of like assembling and putting something together. The artisan-like inventiveness and the discursiveness that combine these elements, which are all in general circulation and rather drab. Statistical inquiry and breaking down these efficacious meanderings into units that it defines itself, and reorganizing the results of its analysis according to its own codes, finds only the homogeneous, the same. The power of its calculations lies in its ability to divide, but it is precisely through this analytic fragmentation, this breaking down, that it loses sight of what it claims to seek and to represent. I'm going to skip this. Well, no, this is an important distinction that he starts to make. Maybe the distinction of the book. Trajectory suggests a movement, but it also involves a plane projection, a flattening out. It is a transcription, a graph, which the eye can master, is substituted for an operation. This is what he's saying statistics does. A line which can be reversed, that is read in both directions, does duty for an irreversible temporal series, a tracing for acts. To avoid this reduction, so to avoid the thing that the flattening out of reality that he thinks is caused by statistics or a statistical approach, he says, I resort to a distinction between tactics and strategies. And this is the core distinction in the book. The book is about tactics. I call a strategy the calculus of force relationships which becomes possible when a subject of will and power, a proprietor, an enterprise, a city, a scientific institution, can be isolated from an environment. So when you have this thing over here that's like a center of power and it stands over and against some environment, a strategy assumes a place that can be circumscribed as proper, and thus serve as the basis for generating relations with an exterior distinct from it, competitors, adversaries, clienteles, targets, or objects of research. Political, economic, and scientific rationality has been constructed on this strategic model. So strategy is the thing that belongs to some center of power, or it's the mode of acting for some center of power. And political, economic, and scientific rationality is constructed on this model of strategy of a center. And which philosophy do I follow in my daily life? I'm reading this question in the chat. Well, the Certeau's philosophy is certainly one that is very important to me. There are others which I've made some videos on, but I like this idea of philosophy as a way of life. So it's not necessarily a specific set of ideas or principles as much as it is a way of practicing philosophy in the day-to-day. But if you want to know more about how I think about that, I'll make another video outlining some options there. But I also have a few videos that might give you some insights, a few other videos already posted that might give you some insights into that. So he's discussed what a strategy is. On the other hand, we have this thing called a tactic, which he says is a calculus which cannot count on a proper, a spatial or institutional localization, nor thus on a borderline distinguishing the other as a visible totality. So whereas the person or institution that exercises a strategy stands over and against the environment, he's saying a tactic is insinuated in the environment. It can't be separated out. The place of a tactic belongs to the other. It has no place of its own, no proper. A tactic insinuates itself into the other's place fragmentarily, without taking it over in its entirety, without being able to keep it at a distance. It has at its disposal no base where it can capitalize on its advantages, prepare its expansions, and secure independence with respect to circumstances. And if you remember earlier, he mentioned the Spanish colonizers and the indigenous populations that they colonized. And he talked about how those populations used the sort of culture that was imposed on them in ways that were went against the intention, that were subversive. So they didn't have their own like cultural place of authority and power, but on someone else's territory, they exercised these subversive tactics. So he says the proper is a victory of space over time. On the contrary, because it does not have a place, a tactic depends on time. It is always on the watch for opportunities that must be seized on the wing. Whatever it wins, it does not keep. It must constantly manipulate events in order to turn them into opportunities. The weak must continually turn to their own ends, forces alien to them. This is achieved in the propitious moments when they are able to combine heterogeneous elements. Thus, in the supermarket, the housewife, or we'll just say the person shopping, confronts heterogeneous and mobile data. What she has in the refrigerator, the tastes, appetites, and moods of his or her guests, the best buys and their possible combinations with what is already on hand at home. The intellectual synthesis of these given elements takes the form, however, not of a discourse, but of the decision itself, the act and manner in which the opportunity is seized. So this is his idea of a tactic in a nutshell. And to go back to just a couple of paragraphs previously, he's saying that this kind of seizing the opportunity is irreducible to statistics. It's something that can't be pinned down through statistical analytical methods. Many everyday practices, talking, reading, moving about, shopping, cooking, etc., are tactical in character. And so are, more generally, many ways of operating. Victories of the weak over the strong, whether the strength be that of powerful people or the violence of things or of an imposed order, etc. Clever tricks, knowing how to get away with things, hunter's cunning, maneuvers, polymorphic simulations, joyful discoveries, poetic as well as warlike. The Greek called these ways of operating metis, but they go much further back to the immemorial intelligence displayed in the tricks and imitations of plants and fishes from the depths of the ocean to the streets of modern megalopolises. There is a continuity and permanence in these tactics. So this is the theme of the book. He comes back to this idea of ways of operating. How do users or consumers operate in the world in ways that resist and undermine the power structures that discipline our lives? And Taylor says that the perspective here is slightly different from an anthropology linguistics perspective. I would really like to know what those other lenses are. Feel free to drop any details you might have on that in the chat as well. Maybe we can get a few more things on the table. I'm not going to read this paragraph, but I'm going to note this term, Brownian movement, this idea of randomness. So he's taking another analogy, this time from physics. And he's also going to say the discipline of rhetoric offers another model for this. The ways that language is used that are sort of seizing the linguistic opportunity. And he prioritizes actually the sophists. So this is interesting. Later on, he'll mention philosophy versus sophistry, and actually suggest that philosophy operates from a place. So philosophy uses strategies, whereas sophism is this, if you're familiar with the sophists from ancient Greece, they were criticized for saying that you could make an argument for anything. And they would say, like, tell me your conclusion and I'll tell you how to make an argument for it. So sort of maybe like marketing today. But the Certeau actually he thinks sophism has an affinity to this idea of tactics. Now, this is probably one of the places where I would want to part ways with the Certeau, because the idea, well, what's good about sophism is this idea of tactics, or sort of like philosophical tricks in a way that subvert power. There's something attractive about that. But I also like the idea of philosophy as something that allows for resistance from say, perhaps in a place of internal stability, where that place is my own agency and my own autonomy. And I think de Certeau kind of cuts off that possibility. But I think if we want to resist power with some real internal force, we might need something a little bit better, a little bit more stable than sophism. So we've talked about everyday practices, reading, dwelling, cooking. I don't think that needs to be expanded on. He says also the activity of reading is a tactic as well. So he thinks the written text, you can see my cat's tail, she jumped up on this chair with me. He thinks writing is a strategy, whereas, this is sassy, whereas reading is a tactic. So the reader insinuates into another person's text the ruses of pleasure and appropriation. He poaches on it, is transported into it, pluralizes himself in it like the internal rumblings of one's body. Ruse, metaphor, arrangement, this production is also an invention of the memory. This mutation of reading makes the text habitable, like a rented apartment. So it's not your own place, and that's key. Writing creates this place. Sassy, said Taylor. Yeah, Sassy says hello. It transforms another person's property into a space borrowed for a moment by a transient. So reading thus introduces an art, which is anything but passive. So he'll expand on this later in the book. Again, I don't think I need to read these paragraphs in detail. Let's see where we are in terms of this introduction. Just about there. I'm just going to see if there's any other key paragraphs here that should be touched on. So just a couple of last things. He is concerned. He comes back to the individual, which at the beginning he kind of dismissed, the status of the individual in technical systems, specifically because the involvement of the subject diminishes in proportion to the technocratic expansion of these systems. This is one reason why I think de Certeau is so relevant still. That is because we are seeing dramatic technocratic expansion over the last 10, 20 years, and even over the last few years as AI is becoming a thing. I think the possibility for the need to find out what resistance looks like in this moment is perhaps more important than it's ever been. Thanks, Samina, for this this comment about reading. Yeah, I hope maybe this opens up a new perspective for you. It sounds like, which is awesome. I think reading is one of the most creative things, productive things we can do. And Alan, welcome. Thanks for the comment. So increasingly constrained, he's still talking about the individual in these technocratic systems, yet less and less concerned with these vast frameworks. The individual detaches himself from them without being able to escape them, and can henceforth only try to outwit them, to pull tricks on them, to rediscover within an electronicized and computerized megalopolis the art of the hunters and rural folk of earlier days. The fragmentation of the social fabric today lends a political dimension to the problem of the subject. And earlier, if you recall, he said that everyday practices have a political dimension. And this is part of what's so interesting to me about this book, is that he adds this layer of significance to things that we might not think about, the way we go shopping. Composting is another thing I often think of in this regard, as a sort of tactic. In support of this claim can be adduced the symptoms represented by individual conflicts in local operations, and even by ecological organizations, though these are preoccupied primarily with the effort to control relations within the environment collectively. A politics of such ploys should be developed. I'm going to skip through just a little bit. Such politics should also inquire into the public, democratic image of the microscopic, multiform, and innumerable connections between manipulating and enjoying the fleeting and massive reality of a social activity at play with the order that contains it. Witold Gombrowicz, an acute visionary, gave this politics its hero, the anti-hero who haunts our research, when he gave a voice to the small-time official, Musil's man without qualities, or that ordinary man to whom Freud dedicated civilization and its discontents, whose refrain is, when one does not have what one wants, one must want what one has. I have had, you see, to resort more and more to very small, almost invisible pleasures, little extras. You've no idea how great one becomes with these little details. It's incredible how one grows. So that's a fitting conclusion to this introduction. Um, thank you for these comments. I appreciate it. This is a really interesting text. It's hard. It's hard to access. The writing is very rich, but also somewhat convoluted. Um, if you are just joining in, this was a live philosophy hour where I read most of the introduction to Michel de Certeau's book, The Philosophy of Everyday Life. I plan to continue reading through some sections of this book. I may not read the whole thing, but I'll have at least a couple more sessions on the book. My plan is to host these live streams every week, and I will post information about those in advance. So if you're just jumping in, still feel free to drop your name or any questions or comments you might have. Yeah, thanks very much for joining, and I hope to see some of you next week.